Welcome to this webinar. Due to the sensitive nature and content within these sessions, we would advise you undertake the training in a private space where you are unlikely to be interrupted. All contact numbers for the agencies mentioned within this webinar will be provided as a PDF file to download. We will use the words survivor and victim interchangeably to portray those on the receiving end of domestic abuse. This webinar is brought to you in partnership with Mid and West Wales Vawdr SV Partnership, West Wales Domestic Abuse Service and Petals Training. Rurality and Isolation. All too often, rural communities and its people play second fiddle to the clamour of urban demands. We see this in all sorts of ways, from access to broadband, public transport, shops and amenities. There is also the issue of domestic abuse within rural communities. The peaceful image most people have in their mind when conjuring up the countryside is not always the reality. Sadly, domestic abuse survivors are all too often lost to support, policing and criminal justice services. They are hidden under our noses, hidden by abusers who like to keep it that way. A 2019 report by the National Rural Crime Network found that rural victims are half as likely to report their abuse to others. Also, the abuse of rural victims goes on significantly longer. This is indicated in the report's research, indicating abuse lasts, on average, 25% longer in these often isolated areas. Rural victims cannot readily access support services and live in an area of society that actually protects the perpetrators. Often these victims are isolated, unsupported and unprotected, in a rural hell which is purposefully normalised. That is why it is so important to shine a light on the work in West Wales being undertaken by specialist services working in the domestic abuse field with all types of survivors. Geographically, much of the current research on domestic abuse is focused on urban rather than rural populations, yet the rate of domestic abuse is greater in rural communities in comparison to urban communities. Whilst rural and urban populations share some similarities within specific trends of domestic abuse, perpetrators within rural settings engage in more chronic and severe domestic abuse. This is often combined with higher rates of substance abuse and unemployment compared to perpetrators in urban settings. What types of abuse are witnessed in rural areas? Research indicates that domestic abuse survivors in rural settings differ from those in urban settings in that they experience worse psychosocial and physical health outcomes. Additionally, rural survivors also face greater obstacles in accessing resources and receiving adequate support. This amplifies challenges in leaving an abusive relationship. Very little research is available on this area of abuse. What resonates in these cases is that if communities do not openly discuss and consider domestic abuse, victims will not come forward. Within rural areas, there may be close-knit communities where victims are wary of sharing their problems for fear of local gossip. Also, living in isolated farms can further reduce access to support. In both scenarios, the abuse remains hidden. People in more rural areas may choose to live in caravans, outside dwellings, off-grid, etc. This in itself poses the problem of access to all the facilities available in a more urban area, for example, connectivity, broadband, telephone, etc. Often more subtle is that a survivor will not want to be marginalised within their community and will attempt to normalise the abuse in order to protect their privacy even further. This fear of being ostracised is a powerful deterrent in seeking support. What we observe in rural Wales are generations of deeply private people. The issue of abuse is considered a private issue and not in the public domain. No one wants to disturb the peace. People fear becoming involved in domestic disputes as they do not wish to be perceived as busybodies. People will turn a blind eye to possibly abusive situations. Particularly in rural Wales, victims and perpetrators may not see abuse is actually happening. Victims will perceive their abuser as just the way they are. This can be a normalised situation for both parties. In rural settings, the complexities of issues such as dependent animals, for example a pet or working animal who is of importance to them, may be weaponised. If they leave, the animal may be used as a threat against them. For example, the animal may be hurt in some way. Challenges and risks for survivors in rural areas. A woman in rural Wales may not access support as she feels it is her duty to stay with a man who has continuously cheated or abused her. The generally held belief system may dictate the idea of marriage as all important, and therefore the victim may avoid accessing help. Existing research has indicated that rural women are confronted with unique risks, needs, and barriers that prevent them from accessing critical services. There are numerous challenges in rural areas. Some worry that by speaking out or seeking support, they will be unfairly judged. Simply by seeking help, those fears can be allayed. The organisations who work with victims of abuse offer support from the point of view that it is not the fault of the victim. It is the behaviour of the perpetrator that is unacceptable. The challenge is to encourage them to speak out in the first instance. They need to know the support is relevant to their requirements. Many fear that if they disclose the abuse, they may lose everything they hold dear. This may prevent disclosure. For example, losing friends, deep-seated roots in the community, belonging, possibly seen as a matriarch of the area not wanting to lose this status, and shame at not being seen as the perfect household or pillar of the community. Often the victim's home is part of their inheritance. The thought of being forced to leave or perhaps leaving dependents behind will deter them. The loss of income coupled with the perceived shame of losing what that financial support offers also impacts on the decision to report the abuse. Likewise, they may also be reluctant to claim state benefits for the shame this causes. This will not sit comfortably with the depiction of rural life in a beautiful home in the country. The impact of rurality in relation to abuse. The most obvious risk factor for rural women experiencing domestic abuse is geographic distance and isolation. Geographic barriers have had a profound and direct impact on women experiencing domestic abuse in rural environments, as it greatly increases victim vulnerability. Geographic isolation also means greater distances between homes, being less visible to neighbours or other potential witnesses, and being further away from the emergency services. The physical isolation can also translate into social isolation, both of which can contribute to the likelihood of domestic abuse and more power and control for the perpetrator. We also need to consider that should a victim be visited in their homes for support whilst the partner is at work, the mere presence of a new vehicle in a remote area could arouse suspicion. We also need to factor in the great British weather. Ice and snow on rural roads make it difficult for people to access support, thereby further distancing them from help. Limited public transport. Furthermore, geographic isolation in conjunction with other barriers such as poor public transport can also contribute to limited access to appropriate resources, which inherently complicates the process of leaving an abusive relationship. Research examining rural women's access to healthcare services found that rural women had to travel 3 times farther for these services than urban women. Respectively, 25% of rural women versus 1% of urban women travelled over 40 miles. In addition, public transport may not even be an option for many rural victims, as services are often cut back or completely removed. This further cuts people off from the specialist support that often exists in more urban areas. This has been further impacted by services shutting down during the pandemic. Since the pandemic, specialistic services have reached out to offer support using new technologies, for example, Teams or Zoom. Whilst on the surface this closes the gap between rural and urban areas, it is not without its inherent benefits and risks. By relying more on phone technology, many survivors have said that for the first time they have been able to access a service as they have not needed to leave their home. Conversely, those in rural areas with poor bandwidth have been less able to use this support. We also need to take into account that if the perpetrator is in the home, this still prevents the victim reaching out for help online. Locations difficult to access. Domestic abuse victims also find resources are few and far between in comparison with urban areas. The lack of services includes safe housing within their locality, requiring a move out of the area. During the pandemic, there have been many public services adversely affected. Due to health and safety legislation, frontline workers were unable to work face-to-face with families. The building of trust during this type of support is a vital part of the overall process. All of these are essential considerations to domestic abuse victims seeking help. Rural communities often lack the number of specialised services for domestic abuse that typically exist in urban communities, which create significant issues of accessibility. Challenges. In sparsely populated rural areas, the distances travelled both by support workers and survivors, and anyone who wants to change their behaviour, can be a real challenge. Narrow B roads, off-track, one-track, large slow farm vehicles, etc., can all impede those needing to access urgent support. The problems with rural roads and infrastructure also impacts on the response times of the police and emergency services. In small village communities, it is likely that everyone will be well known to the neighbours, often to an intrusive degree. Within a rural context, cultural values tend to be somewhat different in comparison to urban values. Some rural values, such as cultural beliefs about religion, i.e. permanence of marriage, importance of privacy, and dominance of patriarchal attitudes, may be considered problematic as they may provide a context that sanctions domestic abuse and places rural women at an increased vulnerability of domestic abuse. These cultural attitudes also often discourage women from being assertive and can maintain and foster the stigma of domestic abuse. The accepted stigma in relation to men being abused often means that they may not come forward as often as female survivors. Dating, personal safety and the wider context of abuse. We therefore need to consider that not all victims of domestic abuse are women. The same applies to all victims of abuse in rural areas, including men. The important issue is that as professionals, working with men in isolated areas, we should not make an assumption that they are always the perpetrators. We should engage in the conversation of what is going on in the relationship rather than assume. A man living in a rural community where he is well known, but experiencing abuse, whether from a partner, sibling, parent or child, may feel emasculated. Yet abuse is wrong and men need to be encouraged to seek help from whatever source is available to them, without any shame or embarrassment. It is critical that men in rural areas talk about potentially abusive behaviours. If they fail to do this, then others who may be experiencing abuse will not come forward. The language pattern amongst men may contribute to the laddish culture that men need to be seen as tough. For instance, rugby is for hard men, whereas footballers are depicted as weaklings when tackled. There is a need to challenge these outdated ideas. Instead of the often depicted white heterosexual communities, we need images highlighting that diversity exists everywhere, including abuse. We need images that portray domestic abuse occurring in heterosexual, gay, lesbian, bisexual relationships and between different family members. We also need to consider safety for all in rural areas. For example, as has been seen by the emergence of the pandemic, more people are using dating applications. In rural areas, provided people have access to broadband, this is seen as a good way of improving the isolation and developing relationships. Worryingly, places to meet are more likely to be isolated and far from any services to access help. The shame and stigma associated within the LGBTQ+ relationships in a rural area is further impacted by the preconceived image of a classical heterosexual family. this could further isolate someone experiencing abuse within this type of relationship. If rural communities fail to discuss LGBTQ+, people will find it harder to seek help and advice. When considering domestic abuse, we need to consider all contexts. When living in a community that suppresses these conversations, it is much harder for victims to come forward due to homophobia or hate crime. Victims are even blamed by virtue that the fault is due to their type of relationship. Domestic abuse is suffered by everyone. Lack of connectivity. This process becomes further complicated by the close-knit community networks that inhibit anonymity during help seeking. In fact, people in rural communities are less likely to seek help than urban areas due to the increased likelihood of victims knowing who's working in the community services that they are trying to access. The lack of anonymity, combined with the nature of cultural norms often being incompatible, even shaming of help-seeking behaviours, further increases the likelihood of the victim remaining silent. When we combine isolated areas, access to firearms and lack of connectivity, we also see another dangerous picture emerging. The presence of firearms can be a major risk factor in rural settings. Firearms within rural communities are often viewed as culturally acceptable and a means for carrying out community practices such as farming and protection. However, an abuser's access to firearms is considered to be the most dangerous predictor of domestic homicide, even when considering other key risk factors. Historically, as we have already stated, people in rural areas are less likely to report any abuse they suffer compared to those who live in towns and cities. And it has become worse during the pandemic, where accessing support or talking to someone safely has been more difficult. For 2 years, responding to reports of domestic abuse has been a priority for Dyfed-Powys Police, and after communicating this to the public, the force has seen an increase in the number of incidents reported. Before 2018, there would be about 350 incidents recorded a month. Now the number has risen to around 800 a month. The above information is found within the recent publication involving S4C, West Wales DAS, and the Office of Police and Crime Commissioner. How can we support survivors? There is no them and us when we are thinking about victims and survivors of domestic abuse. They may be our friends, our family, our neighbours and our colleagues. Domestic abuse affects women, men, children, the LGBTQ+ communities, and does not discriminate against age. It is not always easy to immediately recognise the signs that someone is being abused. We encourage those who notice something that is not quite right, whether it be a friend, neighbour, or someone from their community, to look, listen, and ask. Some of the things to look out for could be a friend being texted an inappropriate number of times by their partner when they are not together, or sudden inappropriate lack of contact from someone, or overhearing abusive language from neighbours during an argument. We all have a responsibility to look out for the signs of someone being manipulated and abused. If you are aware that someone may be in this situation, signpost them to the relevant domestic abuse organisation. If you do decide you would prefer to speak to the police, you can call 101 or obtain advice from the specialist services in your area. Where to access support? Across Wales, in every region, there are specialist domestic abuse services. These are supported by the All Wales Live Fear-Free helpline, which operates 24 hours, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, and is a confidential support helpline for anyone, whether male or female, who needs some support and help. The helpline links a network of specialist domestic and sexual abuse organisations. West Wales DAS Specialist Service. One of these is West Wales Domestic Abuse Service. Based in Ceredigion in West Wales, the service offers support for both adult survivors and children and young people. West Wales DAS provide safe housing through refuge and move-on accommodation, one-to-one support work to address trauma and effects of domestic abuse, support people through group work such as the Freedom Programme, which identifies abusive behaviour, to programmes such as the Recovery Toolkit, which empowers people to recover and build a positive abuse-free life, access to counselling, legal advice and support through court processes. We also work with other agencies such as Housing, CAB, IDVA Service, Drug Services, New Pathways, Mind and others to support anyone, whether adult, young person or child, who is worried about themselves or someone they know who is experiencing domestic abuse. Case study. This is a story of one woman. Because it is a survivor's words and experiences, they convey so powerfully what it means to be a victim or survivor of vowed RSV. Hearing from real people helps others to understand the particular issues for those living in rural communities. Linda experienced more than 2 decades of unimaginable violence and abuse at the hands of her former husband. Linda sought assistance from police on at least 2 occasions in the late 90s. However, Linda never felt that she or her children were safe enough because her husband owned the farm and was very well known in the village they lived in. Linda and her children were vulnerable to further and even more severe forms of abuse. Linda's daughter, Jane, has explained how over the years she watched her father become a more aggressive, enraged and threatening man, rarely with any consequence for his crimes. Her father, she said, was always outwardly empowered by his previous victories. He was proud of getting away with so much and felt he was outside the hands of the law. The inaction not only empowered her father, it rendered the rest of the family powerless. Without the support of the police, it took Linda another 14 years before she accessed our service. In all that time she fended for herself. His abuse was not always violent, but was more controlling, not allowing Linda the opportunity to go out with friends. When she did go out, he would always ring her about some problem in the house, so she would have to make excuses and leave. On one occasion, Linda and her 2 children fled to a neighbour's house and then travelled 30 miles on a bus as they attempted to seek refuge from the abuse which, by then, had become part of their daily lives. But Linda's husband would always find them. Jane recalled how her father would stalk local refuges to find her mother. He was obsessive. He had to find her. He had to have her. He had to control her. He had to own her, she said. Whenever he did find Linda and their children, he would force them to return home with him. I am pleased to say that Linda succeeded in leaving her former husband. She had to move away from Wales, keeping her location hidden after a divorce. Sadly, though, her sense of real safety is now only the result of him passing away of old age, not because she succeeded in moving away. She said, on her last day of support, "It's really hard to believe that I'm actually free. I don't have to run and hide anymore. There's so many things I've wanted to do for so long, and now I can finally do them. I can rest easy as he is now dead, and thank goodness." Prevalence of violence against women. Many people I talk to in Ceredigion are surprised to learn that Linda's story is not an isolated case of abuse. Statistics are important as they help us to understand the magnitude and nature of the problem of vowed RSV in Wales. But more than that, stories like Linda's provide an important context. They tell us what the statistics cannot, about the day-to-day reality of living with violence in a rural context. This story is particularly important as it also indicates why we, as people working in this region of Wales, need to ensure that we are up to date with the different organisations and support services that are available in West Wales. For all of us, it is important that we know about the various agencies that can help. For 24-hour support, we can refer to the Live Fear Free helpline, and of course, if someone is in immediate risk of harm or danger, don't delay, dial 999. We also have 8 survivor support services in West Wales, including West Wales Domestic Abuse Service, New Pathways for Sexual Abuse and Violence Services, Carmarthen DAS, Threshold, Callan, Montgomeryshire Family Crisis Centre, Hafan Cymru, Pobl. Support services for those displaying the behaviour. We need to identify and stop harmful behaviours as soon as they occur, and use emerging evidence and practice to increase and improve the responses that challenge harmful behaviour. Save lives. To deliver long-term sustainable change and reduce the number of victims, we must challenge perpetrators to stop. For support services for those displaying the behaviours and wanting to change, can contact 3 local services and a UK charity for support and advice. Threshold, Callan, Montgomeryshire Family Crisis Centre, and Respect, UK-wide. Thank you for your time and attention today. Contact details for all agencies within this presentation can be found within the PDF document attached.